100,000 warriors stood ready in the Ethiopian highlands. Against them, a modern European army armed with rifles and artillery. Every expert said the result was certain. Every European power had already placed their bets. They were all wrong. On the first day of March, 1896, Emperor Menelik II of Ethiopia shattered one of the most powerful myths of the colonial age, that African sovereignty was merely a question of time. Italy had come to claim an empire. It left without its army, without its generals, and without its pride. The Battle of Adwa was not an accident, not a lucky stroke, and not a miracle. It was a masterpiece of strategy, diplomacy, and national will, and it changed the world. "100,000 Ethiopian warriors had already gathered in the northern highlands before General Oreste Baratieri ever gave the order to advance. That single fact overturns almost every assumption Europe held about Africa in the 19th century. Understanding how Ethiopia arrived at this moment requires stepping back 7 years to a treaty, a single mistranslated verb, and a deception that would cost Italy everything. By the 1880s, Europe's great powers were dismembering the African continent in what historians call the scramble for Africa. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European nations carved up territory they had never surveyed and drew borders through peoples they had never met. Italy, newly unified as a nation only in 1861, arrived late to this contest. Ambitious to prove itself a great power, Rome set its sights on the Horn of Africa, specifically on the ancient empire of Abyssinia, which Europeans called Ethiopia. To understand the man who would defeat them, one must understand Menelik II. Born in 1844 in Ankober, in the southern Ethiopian province of Shua, he had spent part of his youth as a captive of Emperor Tewodros II. He escaped, consolidated power over Shua, and built an extraordinary coalition of Ethiopian princes. When Emperor Johannes IV died in battle in 1889, Menelik claimed the imperial throne as Emperor of all Ethiopia. He was shrewd, patient, and willing to use his enemies' ambitions against them. Italy saw Menelik's succession as an opportunity. In May of 1889, Count Pietro Antonelli, representing the Kingdom of Italy, met with Menelik at the Ethiopian town of Wuchale to sign a treaty of friendship and commerce. The Treaty of Wuchale, as it became known, had 20 articles written in 2 languages, Amharic and Italian. Everything about it seemed reasonable, everything except Article 17. In the Amharic version, Article 17 stated that the Emperor of Ethiopia could use the government of Italy for dealings with other powers. In the Italian version, the same article stated that he must. The difference between those 2 words, can and must, was the difference between an alliance and a colonial protectorate. By October of 1889, Italy had informed every European government that Ethiopia was now an Italian protectorate under the Treaty of Wuchale. Menelik discovered the deception only when his letters to Queen Victoria of Britain and Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany were returned with the instruction that he must direct all correspondence through Rome. He was furious. Menelik spent the next several years protesting diplomatically and preparing militarily. He imported modern European weapons on a massive scale, rifles from France and Russia, artillery pieces from multiple suppliers. He reformed Ethiopia's antiquated taxation and supply systems so that a large army could be raised and sustained in the field. He strengthened ties with France, Italy's rival in the Mediterranean, and welcomed the Swiss engineer Alfred Elg as a trusted advisor. By September of 1890, Menelik formally repudiated Italy's protectorate claim. In 1893, he officially and publicly denounced the entire Treaty of Wuchale. Italy's response was predictable. It prepared for war. The stage was set not by accident, but by design. Italy's design to build an empire, and Menelik's design to deny them one. Empress Taytu Betul, Menelik's formidably intelligent wife, had reportedly been the first to push back against Italian demands telling an Italian diplomat who warned of consequences, "We too must retain our dignity." Those words would define everything that followed. What did Italy actually believe it was walking into? And how badly had it miscalculated the enemy it was about to face? Italy believed it was walking into a fragmented collection of rival tribes. It was about to confront a unified nation-state. By the mid-1890s, Italian Prime Minister Francesco Crispi had committed his government to an aggressive colonial policy in East Africa. Italian forces had established a colony of Eritrea on the Red Sea coast and extended their influence into the northern Ethiopian province of Tigray. The anti-colonial movement within Italy was unusually strong for a European power. Students at the University of Rome marched through the streets chanting support for Menelik even after early Italian setbacks. Crispi needed a decisive victory before political patience collapsed. In September of 1895, Menelik issued a proclamation to all Ethiopians. His words, recorded by contemporaries and cited in multiple historical accounts, were direct. "Our enemies have begun the affair by advancing and digging into the country like moles. With the help of God, I will not deliver up my country to them. Today, you who are strong, give me your strength, and you who are weak, help me with your prayer." Within weeks, warriors came from every province of the empire. The mobilization was extraordinary by any standard. Menelik assembled an army of over 100,000 men, equipped with more than 70,000 modern rifles and nearly 50 artillery pieces. Empress Taytu Betul raised a force of 6,000 soldiers of her own. Ras Makonnen, cousin to Menelik and father of the future emperor Haile Selassie, commanded 12,000 troops from the province of Hara. Regional princes who might have been rivals in other circumstances marched under the imperial banner, united by the threat to Ethiopian sovereignty. The Italians, relying on faulty intelligence and racial assumptions, estimated that Menelik could field perhaps 30,000 men, at most. They were wrong by a factor of 3. Menelik reinforced their miscalculation deliberately. He leaked false reports suggesting widespread discord among his forces and understated the size of his army to visiting foreign observers. Even the Italian journalist Adolfo Rossi, reporting for the Corriere della Sera, had warned repeatedly that Italian forces were dangerously overstretched and was expelled from the Italian command in mid-February 1896 for writing what he called the uncomfortable truth. The campaign opened in late 1895 with significant Ethiopian strikes. On the 7th of December 1895, Ras Makonnen's forces annihilated an Italian column at the Battle of Amba Alagi. Major Pietro Tosselli was killed. General Aramondi barely escaped. This was not a skirmish, it was a warning that Italy chose to ignore. By early January of 1896, Menelik and Empress Taytu had arrived in Tigray at the head of the main imperial army. Taytu demonstrated her tactical brilliance at the siege of Mekelle. Rather than ordering a costly frontal assault on the fortified Italian position, she directed her forces to cut off the fort's water supply entirely. On the 21st of January, the Italian garrison surrendered without a shot. Menelik allowed the defeated Italians to leave with their weapons and provided mules and pack animals for their withdrawal to Adigrat. The two armies now faced each other across the cold northern plateau. Baratieri, the Italian commander, preferred to dig in and wait, believing the massive Ethiopian army would eventually exhaust local food supplies and be forced to retreat. His government had other ideas. On the 28th of February, 1896, Prime Minister Crispi sent Baratieri a furious telegram accusing him of military inaction and demanding decisive offensive action. It was the telegram that sealed Italy's fate. What happened when Baratieri finally gave the order to advance and why the night march that followed turned into catastrophe is one of the most dramatic stories in the history of modern warfare. On the night of the 29th of February 1896, Baratieri ordered his army into the darkness. He would not see it again as a coherent force. The Italian plan was ambitious in theory and disastrous in execution. 4 brigades commanded by Generals Albertone, Arimandi, de Bermuda, and Elena would advance along separate mountain paths through the night, converge at dawn on strong defensive positions around Adwa, and lure Menelik's army into a battle on Italian terms. The terrain was treacherous, the maps were inaccurate, and the columns had no reliable way to maintain communication in the darkness. What Baratieri intended as a coordinated advance became, within hours, a catastrophe in motion. Unknown to the Italian commander, Menelik had already decided to break camp the following morning. His army, living off the land, had exhausted what the local population could supply. The emperor rose before dawn on the 1st of March. Spies brought him immediate news that Italian columns were moving through the passes. Menelik summoned Empress Taytu and his senior commanders. He released his forces, not in a single mass, but in coordinated attacks targeting each isolated Italian column in turn. General Albertone's brigade, leading the Italian advance, overshot its assigned position and effectively marched directly into the Ethiopian camp. It was surrounded and destroyed before the other brigades could respond. General Arimandi's column, sent to support Albertone, encountered massed Ethiopian forces and was itself overwhelmed in a separate engagement. The timing and coordination of the Ethiopian attacks confirmed what the Italians had refused to believe. They faced not a tribal horde but a disciplined army with a coherent strategic plan. General Vittorio d'Abramatta's brigade suffered one of the most complete destructions of the battle. Retreating under pressure, d'Abramatta led his men back into a narrow valley, precisely the kind of ground where Ethiopian cavalry lancers excelled. His body was never recovered. By mid-morning, Menelik released his reserve force of 25,000 men to overwhelm the last organized Italian resistance. The Italian journalist Rossi, who had been expelled weeks earlier for warning of this exact outcome, would later write that the disaster was a direct consequence of political pressure overriding military judgment. His account, preserved in Italian archives, stands as one of the most pointed contemporary indictments of colonial hubris on record. By the afternoon of the 1st of March 1896, Italian forces were in a panicked retreat toward Eritrea. They left behind all 56 artillery pieces and 11,000 rifles. The numbers of the defeated spoke to the scale of the rout. More than 6,000 Italian and Eritrean colonial soldiers killed or missing, nearly 3,000 taken prisoner. In total, roughly 70% of the Italian expeditionary force was killed or captured. Ethiopian losses were also severe. Estimates range from 5,000 to 7,000 killed, with up to 10,000 wounded, but they represented a small fraction of Menelik's total force. The contemporary observer Augustus Wilde, a British consul in the region, described Adwa as the greatest victory of an African over a European army since the time of Hannibal. That assessment, repeated in multiple contemporary European accounts, captured the shock with which the outside world received the news. Within 2 weeks of the battle, Prime Minister Crispi resigned under public fury. Riots broke out in several Italian cities. Students who had marched in support of Menelik at the start of the campaign were now joined by members of parliament calling for complete withdrawal from Africa. The battle was over. The war was won. But the question of what Ethiopia's victory meant for Africa, for European colonialism, for the global order, had only just begun. Menelik II stood on the Adwa battlefield with 3,000 Italian prisoners, a victorious army of 100,000, and the demoralized remnants of Italy's colonial force behind the Eritrean border. He chose not to invade Eritrea. That decision was the most strategically sophisticated act of the entire campaign. Menelik understood that destroying the Italian colony would pull every European power into a new war. He had already won the argument. Now he would win the peace. Negotiations began almost immediately. Italy held no leverage, no prisoners, and no remaining military option. On the 23rd of August 1896, Italy agreed to the unconditional abrogation of the Treaty of Wuchale. The formal Treaty of Addis Ababa, signed on the 26th of October 1896, recognized Ethiopia's absolute independence. The protectorate claim was abandoned entirely. Italy paid an indemnity of 10 million lira for the upkeep of its prisoners. Back in Rome, the domestic fallout was immediate and severe. Prime Minister Crispi resigned within 2 weeks of the battle. Riots broke out in Italian cities, Rome, Milan, Naples. Members of Parliament who had supported the colonial venture now called loudly for complete withdrawal from Africa. The colonial adventure that promised national glory had delivered the most crushing defeat any European army had suffered in Africa in the colonial era. When the prisoners returned to Italy, many soldiers spoke of fair treatment by their captors, a detail that further confounded the racial narratives Italy's press had used to justify the campaign. The world's reaction was immediate and divided. In Europe, the defeat provoked a crisis in colonial assumptions. Some commentators attempted to explain away the result by arguing the Ethiopians were not truly African, a response that historian Raymond Jonas, in his Harvard University Press study, identifies as evidence of just how deeply Adwa destabilized European racial thinking. The victory could not be absorbed within existing frameworks. It had to be explained away, and the effort to do so only proved the point. In Africa, and throughout the African diaspora, there was no ambiguity. W.E.B. Du Bois cited Ethiopia as the model of sovereign African achievement. Pan-African movements across the Caribbean, the United States, and sub-Saharan Africa invoked Adwa as proof that European domination was not inevitable. Scholar Mulfi Asante observed that Ethiopia acquired singular importance as the only surviving African state to defeat a European colonial power in open battle. Pan-African and independence movements across 4 continents would draw directly on Adwa's example in the decades ahead. The diplomatic consequences were transformative. Within months of Adwa, delegations from Britain and France arrived in Addis Ababa to negotiate on genuinely equal terms. France signed a treaty of alliance by March of 1897. By 1903, Menelik concluded a commercial agreement with the United States. He formally established diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire, Russia, and Sudan. Ethiopia joined the International Postal Union in 1908. The nation Europe had tried to reduce to a protectorate now sat as a recognized sovereign member of the international community, corresponding with heads of state, negotiating borders, and setting its own terms. Historians continue to debate whether Menelik's restraint regarding Eritrea was strategic genius or a missed chance to end Italian colonialism in East Africa. The subsequent Italian invasion under Mussolini in 1935, using poison gas against civilians, gives that debate real weight. What lies beyond scholarly dispute is that Adwa fundamentally altered the trajectory of African resistance to European colonialism. As Baru Zoud wrote, few events in the modern period brought Ethiopia to world attention as powerfully as Adwa. The battle proved that European military supremacy was a circumstance, not a law. That proof, once delivered, could not be withdrawn. On the 1st of March 1896, Ethiopia proved what no other African nation had achieved. A colonial invasion could be stopped decisively in open battle. Adwa mattered not because Italy lost. It mattered because the certainty that Africans would fall under European rule was shattered by strategy, unity, and a people who refused. African nations remembered Adwa when they built their independence movements. They remember it still. The outcome of a conflict is decided before the first shot in the choices made by those who refuse to be defined by their enemy's expectations. If you enjoyed this deep dive and learned something new, please like this video and subscribe to Unleash Facts. Your support helps us create comprehensive historical documentaries that bring the past to life. Thank you for watching.